The moment the train pulled away from Caldwell Station in the summer of 1882, leaving behind a thick curtain of black smoke and the fading cry of its whistle, every soul on the platform found someone waiting for them, every soul, that is, except for Eleanor Grace Whitmore. She stood at the edge of the wooden depot platform with a single leather trunk at her feet and a small carpet bag clutched in both hands, watching the backs of strangers disappear into the dusty streets of Caldwell, Kansas, while the station master swept cinders off the boards with a broom that had seen better years. The afternoon sun pressed down on her like a flat iron, relentless and without mercy, turning the air above the tracks into a shimmering, watery mirage. Eleanor did not move. She was 22 years old, she had traveled 3 days by rail from Columbus, Ohio, and she had a name written on a folded piece of paper tucked inside her left glove, the name of the man who was supposed to collect her. Edmund Ferris. She had never met Edmund Ferris in person. She had exchanged 11 letters with him over the course of 4 months, letters that described a prosperous cattle ranch south of town, a decent 3-room house with a real glass window in the front, and a man of 31 years who was steady in his ways and honest in his dealings. His handwriting had been careful, if a little stiff, and he had asked her politely whether she preferred her coffee in the mornings with sugar or without. She had written back that she preferred it without and had added, because she felt it was only fair, that she could cook, sew, mend fences if needed, and that she was not a delicate woman. She had not mentioned that she was leaving Columbus because her father had lost everything at the card tables and had begun to look at her as though she herself were a debt he might collect on. She had not mentioned that she had stood alone on a cold February morning and decided that the West, which she had never seen, was better than certainty she already knew too well. Edmund Ferris had written one final letter confirming her arrival date, and now she stood on the platform of Caldwell Station, 1 hour past when the train had arrived, and he was not here. The station master, a stout man named Harold Briggs with a graying mustache and the air of someone who had witnessed every flavor of human predicament, paused in his sweeping to glance at her a second time. "You still waiting on somebody, miss?" he asked. "I am," Eleanor said. "Train won't come back through until tomorrow morning," he offered, as though this were helpful. "I'm aware," she said, and he nodded and went back to his sweeping. The hour stretched into 2. Eleanor sat down on her trunk because her feet ached from the journey and because there was no point in performing patience while standing when sitting would do just as well. The town of Caldwell spread out before her in a slow, drowsy afternoon arrangement: a general store, a livery, a saloon from which piano music drifted in cheerful disregard of the hour, a barber, a land office with a crooked sign, and several other storefronts she could not read from this distance. A dog slept in the middle of the street without any apparent concern. 2 women in cotton dresses crossed the far side of the road, their parasols bobbing. A wagon rattled past loaded with barrels, and the driver tipped his hat without looking at her. She pulled the folded paper from her glove and read the name again. Edmund Ferris, south of town. She could ask someone, she supposed. She could hire a wagon and go find the man herself, show up at his door with her trunk and her carpet bag and her complete lack of interest in being made to wait. But something kept her on the platform. Some stubbornness she recognized in herself, the same stubbornness that had gotten her onto the train in the first place. She would give him a fair amount of time. She would be reasonable. She would wait. The second hour became the third. Harold Briggs had gone inside to his little office behind the ticket window, and Eleanor was entirely alone on the platform when she heard the sound of a horse coming fast from the south road, hoofbeats heavy and rhythmic against the packed earth, and then slowing as they neared the depot. She turned, and the first thing she saw was the dust. It rose from the rider in a red-brown cloud, coating his dark hat, his shoulders, the flanks of the big roan horse beneath him, as though the trail itself had tried to hold him back and he had ridden through it anyway. He pulled the horse up alongside the platform rail and swung down before the animal had fully stopped, which suggested either great confidence or great urgency, and she could not yet tell which. He was taller than she had expected from the way he moved, which was compact and efficient, nothing wasted. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his neck beneath the brim of his hat, and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of dark stubble above a sun-browned throat. His shirt had been blue once, she thought, before the trail had turned it the color of old bone. There was a long scar along the back of his left hand that she noticed when he pulled off his glove to wipe the dust from his face with the back of his wrist, which did not help much, and his eyes, when he looked at her, were the deep, particular gray of thunderheads gathering over flat country. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not expect to find in the place he was looking, with a kind of careful, arrested attention. "Ma'am," he said, "you been here a while." 3 hours, she said, and she was pleased with how steady her voice was. Something moved across his face, concern, she thought, and something underneath it that she could not name yet. "You Eleanor Whitmore?" The question caught her off guard because she had not expected him to know her name. "I am," she said slowly. "And you are not Edmund Ferris?" "No, ma'am," he said, "am not." He pulled off his hat and held it at his side, and she could see now that the dust had settled into every crease and fold of him, that he had been riding hard for a long time. "My name is Cole Hadley. I ride for the Ferris Ranch, or I did until this morning." Eleanor felt something cold move through her despite the heat. "What happened this morning?" Cole Hadley held her gaze steadily, and she recognized in that steadiness the particular brand of careful honesty that a man uses when he is about to tell a woman something that will change things. "Edmund Ferris rode out yesterday to move some cattle north along the creek. His horse came back this morning without him. We found him near Elk Creek. Looks like the horse threw him in rough ground." He paused. "He did not survive, Miss Whitmore. Am sorry." Eleanor sat very still on her trunk and absorbed this information the way dry ground absorbs the first rain slowly and from the outside in. "He is dead," she said. "Yes, ma'am, am sorry." "I know that is a hard thing to hear when you have come so far." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "His foreman, Mr. Garrett, he sent me to come get you, bring you somewhere you could stay while things get sorted. He felt it wasn't right to leave you standing here." Cole paused, and his jaw tightened slightly. "Seems I rode slower than I should have. Apologize for the time." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had not been in love with Edmund Ferris. She had been practical about that from the start. She had corresponded with a stranger and agreed to build a life with him out of mutual necessity and the reasonable hope that affection might follow. She felt grief for him, she thought, the kind a person feels for any human life cut short, and she felt the particular cold weight of realizing that the plan, the careful, deliberate plan, had dissolved before she could even begin to execute it. But she did not feel the bottom fall out of her heart, because Edmund Ferris had never held any part of it. What she felt, more than anything, was the sheer, exhausting absurdity of her situation. 22 years old, 3 days by train from everything she had ever known, sitting on a trunk in the Kansas dust, and the man she had come to marry was dead in a creek bed. "Well," she said at last, and she heard in her own voice a faint, involuntary note of dark humor that surprised her. "That is the worst possible outcome I had considered." Cole Hadley blinked, and then slowly the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, as though her response had reached him somewhere past his careful formality. "I reckon it is," he said quietly. "Where is this place, Mr. Garrett thinks I should stay?" Eleanor asked. "Town's got a boarding house," Cole said, "run by a widow named Mrs. Halloran. It's clean and she sets a decent table. Mr. Garrett said he'd see to the cost for a week, to give you time to decide what you want to do." Eleanor stood up from her trunk and straightened her jacket, which was thoroughly wrinkled from 3 days of travel, and approximately nothing was going to fix that in the immediate future. "All right," she said. "Then I would appreciate you taking me there." Cole Hadley put his hat back on his head, picked up her trunk with one arm as though it weighed nothing at all, and tied it to the back of his saddle with practiced efficiency. He offered her his hand to help her down from the platform, and when she took it, she felt the roughness of it calloused and warm and real, and then she was standing beside him on the ground, and the roan horse turned its great dusty head and regarded her with one liquid dark eye. "This is Abilene," Cole said, patting the horse's neck. "Of course it is," Eleanor said. This time he did smile, just barely, before he led her down the main street of Caldwell toward the boarding house, walking the horse alongside them. Mrs. Halloran was a compact Irish woman in her late 50s who had survived a husband, a border war, and 2 Kansas winters, and was not noticeably diminished by any of them. She took one look at Eleanor and then one look at Cole and put the entire situation together with the efficiency of a woman who had assembled many such situations before. "You poor dear," she said to Eleanor, taking her carpetbag without asking. "Come in out of that sun." "Have you eaten?" "Not since this morning," Eleanor admitted. "Then you will eat now and sleep after, and tomorrow the world will look somewhat less catastrophic, though probably not entirely." She glanced at Cole, who was still standing on the porch with the dust of the trail on every inch of him. "Cole Hadley, you look like you were dragged behind that horse instead of riding it." "I was in a hurry," he said. "You can water your horse at the trough, and there is a pump around back if you want to wash before you ride out," Mrs. Halloran said with the casual authority of a woman who had been directing traffic through her property for many years. Cole nodded and looked at Eleanor, who was standing in the doorway of the boarding house with the afternoon light behind her turning her dark hair to something close to copper. He had the strange, unwelcome sensation that he was reluctant to leave, which made no sense at all because he had only just met her, and he had a long ride back to the Ferris ranch and a great many things that needed dealing with. "If you need anything," he said, "Mrs. Halloran knows how to reach Mr. Garrett." "Thank you, Mr. Hadley," Eleanor said, and then, because she meant it precisely, "You did not have to come yourself. You could have sent someone else. Appreciate that you came." He looked at her for just a moment too long before he touched the brim of his hat and turned away. She watched him walk around the side of the boarding house, leading the roan horse, and then the door was open and Mrs. Halloran was pulling her inside with the efficient kindness of someone who understood that people sometimes needed to be steered rather than invited. The days that followed were quiet in the way that uncertain days always are, full of small practical actions that hold larger questions at bay. Eleanor helped Mrs. Halloran with the morning meals and the evening washing up, not because she was asked to, but because she could not sit still, and because work had always been the thing that kept her mind from running sideways. She walked the length of the town twice each day, and learned its geography: the grain elevator at the south end, the cattle pens along the rail siding that smelled of everything they held, the newspaper office run by a young man named Thomas Becker, who wore ink-stained cuffs and had opinions about absolutely everything, the church at the north end of town, where the preacher delivered sermons that were long on fire and short on mercy. She went to the land office on the 3rd day and spoke with a man named Delacroix, who had the resigned air of someone who spent his days turning hope into paperwork. He confirmed that Edmund Ferris's property would pass to his brother in Missouri, who was being notified by telegram. The ranch was not Eleanor's and had never been, and the arrangement, the careful, practical, transactional arrangement, was dissolved entirely by Edmund's death. She was not his wife. She had been his intended, and now she was simply a woman in Caldwell, Kansas, with a week's worth of paid board and a trunk full of her belongings and absolutely no plan. She sat outside the land office afterward on a bench in the afternoon shade and thought about Columbus. She thought about her father's house, the smell of stale tobacco and old debt, the way her younger sister Clara had cried when Eleanor left, not because she wanted Eleanor to stay, but because she understood at 16 what it meant that Eleanor felt compelled to go. She thought about the 11 letters she had written to a man she had never met, and the careful optimism she had packed into each one, and the fact that not a single part of any of it had turned out the way it was supposed to. And then she thought, well, all right, think about what there is. There was Caldwell, which was a growing town, which meant it needed things. She could teach. She had been teaching herself and her sister for years after their mother died, and she was good at it. She had seen the schoolhouse on her second walk, a small frame building on the edge of town that looked like it could use both a teacher and a carpenter, and possibly both at once. She had sewn every piece of clothing she owned, and several she had given away. She could set type if Thomas Becker at the newspaper would show her. She had watched him through the window, and the process looked learnable. She had, in other words, several things that were not nothing. She was still sitting with this inventory of herself when the sound of hoofbeats she was beginning to recognize came along the main street, and she looked up to find Cole Hadley riding past on the roan horse. He spotted her at almost the same moment, and he pulled Abilene up and touched his hat. He was cleaner than the first time she had seen him, which was not a high bar but was still an improvement. He had shaved since then, though not today, and she could see his face clearly now, the straight line of his nose, the way his eyes had small lines at their corners from squinting against the sun, the way he sat the horse with a relaxed native ease, as though the horse and he had simply grown together over time. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I was coming to check on you." "Were you?" she said. It came out a little dry, and she saw him read it and recalibrate. "I was coming to check on Mrs. Halloran," he amended. "And also you," she smiled in spite of herself. "She is fine. She is always fine. She is made of some material that does not weather." She looked up at him against the sky. "You rode all the way from the Ferris ranch. Had business in town," he said, and then, after a brief pause that was almost imperceptible but that she caught anyway, "And I wanted to see how you were getting on." He swung down from the horse and tied Abilene to the rail nearby, and then he came and leaned against the post of the building, not quite sitting beside her but close enough that they could speak without raising their voices. "Am making plans," she told him. "What kind of plans?" "Am going to speak to the school board about the teaching position," she said. "I heard from Mrs. Halloran that the school has been without a full-time teacher since spring." He considered this. "You are a teacher." "I'm someone who can teach," she said, which was a different thing, and she thought he understood the distinction. "I'm also considering speaking to Mr. Becker at the newspaper about typesetting. I believe I could learn it." Cole looked at her with an expression she was starting to learn a kind of careful attention, like a man solving a problem he has not fully seen the shape of yet. "You are not going back to Ohio," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not going back to Ohio." He nodded slowly, and she had the impression that this answer had settled something in him, though she could not have said what. "The Ferris foreman, Mr. Garrett, he came by the boarding house yesterday," Eleanor said, "to express his condolences. He said the ranch hands are dispersing, now that things are being wound down for the estate. Imagine that affects you as well." "It does," Cole said. He said it without distress, which either meant he was a man of great equanimity or a man who was accustomed to things not being permanent. "Have been riding cattle since I was 18. There is always another outfit needing hands." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Another outfit?" He looked at her sideways, a little surprised by the directness of the question. Most people, his expression suggested, did not ask cowboys what they wanted. "I have been thinking about my own land," he said after a moment. "There is good grass south of the creek. Ferris never ran cattle on the south quarter. The title is separate. It is going to come available once the estate is settled." He paused. "It is probably foolish." "Why? Starting a small ranch on your own takes more capital than I have saved," he said, practical and without self-pity, "and more than one pair of hands." "It takes time," Eleanor said, "and work, both of which seem like things you have in reasonable supply." He looked at her again with that arrested quality, as though she kept saying things he had not expected. "You are very direct," he said. "I have been known to be," she agreed. For the first time since she had met him, he laughed a real laugh, not the restrained, almost smile of their earlier exchanges, but a genuine sound that rearranged his whole face and made him look younger and less careful and considerably more like someone she wanted to know better. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum, warm and specific. "Come have coffee," she said, standing up from the bench. "Mrs. Halloran makes it strong enough to stand a spoon in, and if you have ridden from the ranch in this heat you probably need something." "I would not say no to that," he said, and he untied Abilene and led the horse alongside them as they walked the 2 blocks back to the boarding house, and he told her about the south quarter of the creek land and the kind of grass it held, and she told him about the schoolhouse she had peered through the window of, and the fact that several of the floorboards needed replacing, and by the time they reached the front porch of the boarding house she felt, for the first time since stepping off the train, that the shape of her life in this place was beginning to assemble itself out of the dust and uncertainty, not yet clear, not yet solid, but present in a way it had not been 3 hours ago. Mrs. Halloran set 3 cups on the kitchen table without being asked, and then found reasons to be in the other room, which Eleanor appreciated and which Mrs. Halloran executed with such transparent cheerfulness that it was almost endearing. They sat across from each other with the strong coffee between them, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay in a gold bar across the table. And Cole Hadley asked her about Ohio, not the way people ask when they are simply being polite, but the way someone asks when they are genuinely trying to understand where a person came from, and she told him about Columbus, about the school she had attended until she was 17, about her mother who had taught her to read with a Bible and a newspaper, and the firm conviction that a woman without letters was a woman at someone else's mercy. She told him about her sister Clara, about her father, about the combination of circumstances that had put her on a westbound train with a name in her glove, and she told him without performing any particular emotion about it, just the facts of it, laid out honestly. He listened the way a good listener listens, with his full attention and without filling the silences. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I lost my father's ranch when I was 23, drought and bad debt. My mother went to live with her sister in Texas, and I just started writing." He said it the same way she had told her story, plainly, without self-pity or drama, just the shape of what had happened. "Have been writing for 9 years. Am 32 now." "And you have been saving," she said. "And I have been saving," he agreed. They sat in comfortable quiet for a moment, which was unusual for people who had known each other less than 4 days, and Eleanor thought about the fact that comfort like this was not common and should perhaps be noted. "Mr. Hadley," she said. "Cole," he said. "Cole," she repeated, and something in the name felt immediately natural, which she also noted. "What does the south quarter of the creek land cost?" He told her, and she did some silent arithmetic, and she said, "I have money from my mother's estate, not much, but some." He looked at her sharply. "Miss Whitmore, Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor." He said it carefully, as though learning how it fit in his mouth. "Am not asking you for money." "I know you are not," she said. "Am thinking about something else entirely." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "If you are going to try to start a ranch and am going to try to start a life in Caldwell, it seems to me that both of those things are harder alone than they need to be." The kitchen was very quiet. Cole was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something serious and something warm and something that was possibly a little afraid, which made her respect him more rather than less. "We have known each other 4 days," he said. "I know," she said. "Am not proposing a business arrangement to a man I don't trust. Am telling you that I think I trust you, and that would like to keep knowing you, and that I want you to know I intend to stay in Caldwell and build something here." She met his eyes directly. "What you do with that information is entirely up to you." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked down at his coffee and then back up at her, and the expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life, careful and warm and clear, like a sky after a hard rain. "Then I will come back," he said, "if that is all right with you. I will come back and keep knowing you." "That is very much all right with me," she said. And he did come back. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and each time he had less and less excuse and more honesty about the fact that he simply wanted to come, and each time they sat in Mrs. Halloran's kitchen or on the front porch or walked along the edge of town where the prairie grass started, and the sky opened up into something vast and uncompromising, and they talked. They talked about the land and about the law, and about the injustices that ran through this country like a second river, the way the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Cheyenne had been pushed and pushed until the land that had been theirs since before anyone had thought to write anything down was now in the hands of men like Edmund Ferris, bought with government paper and enforced with cavalry. Cole spoke about this without romance or denial, just a plain acknowledgement of the way things were and what it cost, and Eleanor found herself grateful for his honesty, because the newspapers in Columbus had told these stories as though the taking were natural, as though the land had simply been empty and waiting, and she had never entirely believed that. She also met Thomas Becker at the newspaper, who was indeed opinionated about everything but was also genuinely willing to teach, and within 2 weeks she was setting type on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, while Thomas wrote copy and argued with himself about word choices. She applied to the Caldwell School Board and was interviewed by a committee of 3 men who were obviously surprised that she had opinions about reading curriculum and less obviously pleased about it, but who were also pragmatic enough to understand that a capable teacher was better than no teacher, regardless of whether she matched their expectations, and so she was given the position beginning in the fall. She moved from Mrs. Halloran's boarding house into a small rental room above the general store, which was not glamorous but was clean and had a window that faced east so she woke to light instead of darkness, which she had decided was a necessary feature. She bought a small stove from the general store, a set of 3 pans, a decent knife, and 2 chairs, because she had the feeling she might have company worth having a second chair for. Cole Hadley was there on the day she moved her trunk up the stairs, because he had appeared at the boarding house that morning on the roan horse, and she had told him what she was doing, and he had simply rolled up his sleeves and carried things without being asked, which she found more appealing than she was quite ready to admit. Afterward they sat in the 2 chairs with the window open, and the evening air coming through carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain, and he had brought a bottle of cider from the general store below, and she had managed to produce a plate of biscuits from her new small stove, and they sat in the small room above the street and felt together the particular pleasure of a space that is beginning to be a home. "You are good at beginning things," he told her. "I am good at deciding to begin things," she corrected. "They still remain to be seen. I want to talk to the land attorney about the South Quarter," he said. "The estate is moving faster than expected. Edmund's brother does not want to come from Missouri, and he has authorized Delacroix to sell. The South Quarter can be purchased separately." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Are you going to do it?" "I have enough," he said. "If I am careful, it will be tight the first 2 years. 2 years is not forever," she said. He looked at her with that warm, careful look she had come to look for. "No," he said, "it is not." "Cole," she said, "what is happening between us?" She asked it the way she asked most things, directly, without pretense, because pretense in situations like this struck her as a waste of everyone's limited time. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him decide to be equally honest, which she appreciated. "Something I did not expect," he said, "and something I think about considerably more than is probably wise, given that we have known each other less than 3 weeks." "Think about it too," she said. "Eleanor," he said, and he leaned forward in the second chair, the one she had bought in anticipation of him, and he put his hands on his knees and looked at her with total seriousness and total warmth at the same time, which she was beginning to understand was simply the way he was made. I know this whole situation started in a strange way. No, am not who you plan to be here with. I know you have built something of your own here already, something real, and I do not want to complicate that. You do not complicate it, she said quietly. You are part of it. He reached across the small space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and his thumb moved across her knuckles slowly, and she felt it in places that had nothing to do with her hand. Then I would like to court you properly, he said, if you are willing. Am very willing, she said. He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had seen from him yet, reaching all the way to those gray eyes, turning the thunderheads into something else entirely, something clear and open. Like the sky after the rain, he smelled like he had ridden through the first day she met him. The courtship was proper in the technical sense and entirely improper in every other sense, because they were both adults who knew their own minds, and because Caldwell in the summer of 1882 had a great many things to do, and they did most of them together. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon, giving her his second horse, a steady bay mare named Clara, which made her laugh when he told her the name, because of her sister, and they rode south along the creek to the quarter section of land he had put a deposit on. And she walked the grass with him while he told her what he saw there. Not what was there now, but what could be there. The cattle and the fence lines and the house that was better than 3 rooms and had a real glass window in the front. She stood in the middle of the tall grass with the wind moving through it and the sky enormous above her, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was the thing she had been trying to get to all along, not the specific man, not the specific plan, but this feeling, this sense of space and possibility and rootedness at the same time. You see it? He asked. He was standing a few feet from her, watching her face. I see it, she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it loose, and his hand was warm and careful against her cheek, and she turned her face slightly toward it without meaning to, the way a person turns toward warmth, and he made a low sound in his throat, and then he kissed her, gently and deliberately, and she kissed him back with equal deliberateness. And the grass moved around them, and the creek ran nearby, and the sky held the whole thing without comment. I should have asked, he said, pulling back just enough to look at her. You absolutely should have, she agreed. Ask now. May I kiss you, Eleanor? You may, she said, and he did. The summer deepened and settled into them like light into warm ground. He purchased the South Quarter land in August and came to tell her the same afternoon, arriving at the door of her room above the general store with dirt on his boots from the land itself, and a look of contained excitement that he could not quite suppress. She was in the middle of grading some preparatory work she had given herself in advance of the school term opening, and she set the papers aside and listened to him describe it all, the boundaries, the survey stakes, the corner where the creek bent and made a natural windbreak, and she listened with her chin in her hand and watched him come alive talking about it and thought, there it is. There is the whole of this man right here. I need to build a house, he said. A real one. Before winter. Then you had better start, she said. Could use help, he said, choosing things, how the rooms should be arranged. He paused. I would not want to arrange them wrong. She looked at him steadily. Cole Hadley, if you are trying to ask me something, you should simply ask it. He took a breath. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a ring, a simple, small gold band with a single dark garnet set in it. Not fancy, not expensive, but real and deliberately chosen, and she could see that it had taken thought, and she loved it immediately. Eleanor Grace Whitmore, he said, and he was looking at her with total steadiness. No hedging, no pretense, just the full weight of an honest man saying an honest thing. I know it has been only 3 months. I know the way we came to know each other was nothing like conventional. I know you have built something of your own here and that you do not need me to build a life. But I love you. have loved you for a while now, and I did not want to rush you, but I also do not want to spend any more days not telling you plainly what is true. Would you marry me and make a home with me on that land?" Eleanor looked at the ring, and then at the man holding it, the man who had ridden in covered in dust to collect a woman he had never met because he felt it was the right thing to do, the man who listened with his full attention and laughed when she was dry and held her hand gently, and had a dream about a piece of Kansas grass that he was willing to work for. And she thought about every careful letter she had written to a stranger, and understood that none of them had been the right letters because they had all been written to the wrong man. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms, and she felt the solidity of him, the warmth and the realness, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and felt something in her chest unlock that she had not known was locked. "I love you too," she said into his shoulder, "in case that was not obvious from my answer." "I was fairly hopeful," he said, and she felt his voice rumble through his chest, and she laughed, and he held her more tightly, and the late August light came through the east window and lay across both of them like a blessing. They were married in October, before the first frost but after the worst of the summer heat, in the church at the north end of town with the long-winded preacher who turned out, when the occasion required it, to be capable of genuine feeling. Mrs. Halloran sat in the front row with her good dress on, and cried with the serene efficiency of a woman who considered a good wedding a personal achievement. Thomas Becker attended and took notes, which Eleanor had expected and was not offended by. The school board members sat in a group near the back and looked simultaneously pleased and still slightly startled by her, which she had come to understand was simply their permanent expression in her vicinity. Cole had cleaned up as thoroughly as a man could clean up a new shirt, dark trousers, his best boots, and a jacket that fit him well and that he was clearly somewhat uncomfortable in, though he wore it without complaint. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the aisle, and the expression on his face was not something she could describe precisely, only that it was everything she had hoped she would see there, and several things she had not thought a hope for. "You look beautiful," he said, when she reached him, which was not something he had said before. He was not a man who said things unless he meant them fully, and she knew he meant it. "You look very handsome in that jacket," she said. "I feel like a storefront mannequin," he confided under his breath. "You are not," she said. "You look wonderful." The preacher began, and they stood together in front of the small congregation and said the words, and she meant every one of them, and she could tell that he did too. And when he put his hand over hers at the ring, it was warm and steady, the same as it had been from the first moment she had taken it on the platform of Caldwell Depot. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at Mrs. Halloran's boarding house, which Mrs. Halloran had organized with the comprehensive thoroughness of a military campaign, involving 3 kinds of pie, a beef roast that had been turning on a spit since morning, and a fiddle player named Ezra who had learned his trade from some combination of Irish and Mexican traditions, and played with infectious, joyful energy that got even the most stiff-backed members of the school board tapping their feet eventually. Cole danced with Eleanor in the middle of Mrs. Halloran's front room with the furniture pushed aside, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, not formally trained but naturally rhythmic, moving with the same easy competence he brought to horses and open land, and she had learned to dance well from her mother before she died. And between the two of them, they did perfectly well and considerably better than most of the other couples in the room. "Are you happy?" he asked her, his mouth near her ear so she could hear him over the fiddle. "Extraordinarily," she said. "Are you?" He pulled back just enough to look at her, and his eyes were clear and full, and she could see the whole of what he felt in them. "More than I know how to say," he told her honestly. "Then say it later," she said, "when it is quiet." He pressed his lips briefly to her temple. "I will," he promised. The house on the south quarter was not finished. They had the walls and the roof and most of the floor, but the interior was a work in progress, and they had decided to start in it anyway because Caldwell winters were not something to take lightly, and the building would go faster if they were in it working from the inside. It was warm enough with the stove in, and they had a proper bed he had brought out from town on the wagon, and two of the chairs from her room above the general store, and the window, which was real glass and which he had insisted on as though remembering what Edmund Ferris had written in a letter that Cole had never read, but that Eleanor had mentioned once, in passing, when she was telling him the shape of the whole strange story. The nights in the almost finished house were the best part of everything. They lay in the dark with the stars pressing against the window glass and the coyotes talking to each other somewhere south of the creek. And they talked in the way people only talk in the dark, without performance, without any audience but each other, about what frightened them, about what they wanted, about the things they had believed and stopped believing and started believing again. She told him about the morning in Columbus when she had decided to leave, standing in the cold outside her father's house before anyone was awake, and how it had felt not like bravery but like the only available option, which is sometimes what bravery is. He told her about the day the bank had taken his father's ranch, standing in the yard while a man in a suit read from a paper, and the specific way that had rearranged his understanding of what was permanent and what was not. She reached out in the dark and found his hand and laced her fingers through his, and he turned his hand to hold hers back, and they lay like that while the coyotes talked and the wind moved through the grass outside. "We will make this permanent," she said. "This place, this. We will," he said with absolute certainty. The fall term of school opened on a Monday morning in a cold, bright October 2 weeks after their wedding. Eleanor stood at the front of the single-room schoolhouse with 23 children arranged on the benches before her, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she felt the full force of it, the responsibility and the possibility of it, and she thought of her mother, and the newspaper, and the Bible, and the belief that a person without letters is at someone else's mercy. "Good morning," she said, and 23 faces looked back at her with varying degrees of curiosity, wariness, excitement, and yawning indifference. "I am Mrs. Hadley, and I am very glad to be here, and we are going to have a remarkable year." The 12-year-old boy in the second row, who had the specific expression of someone who had survived previous teachers and was reserving judgment, said, "Mr. Jenkins used to bring us candy on Fridays." "Mr. Jenkins is gone," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I will bring you learning on Mondays through Fridays, and we will see if that turns out to be more useful in the long run." The boy considered this. "Can you at least make it interesting?" "That," Eleanor said, "is entirely on both of us." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, with the gravity of a 12-year-old making a genuine contract, and she nodded back with equal gravity, and the school year began. She told Cole about it that evening, sitting by the stove while he worked on fitting the interior window frame to the wall, and he listened and asked questions and laughed at the boy with his candy negotiation, and she thought, "This is what I wanted. Not the specific arrangement of things, not the cattle ranch or the teaching job in particular, but this. Someone to tell the day to. Someone who was genuinely interested in hearing it." The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, as Kansas winters are without apology or exception. The snow came in November and stayed until March, and the temperature dropped to things she had no good language for because Columbus, while cold, had not been this. Cole spent the coldest weeks getting cattle through the worst of it, breaking ice on the creek so they could drink, hauling feed through drifts that came to Abilene's belly, coming in after dark with ice in his beard, and cold that came off him in waves when he opened the door, and she would have hot food and hot coffee ready because she had learned quickly what he needed after those days, and she gave it without drama, just set it on the table and pulled off his boots, while he warmed his hands on the cup and they sat together in the warm light of the stove, and let the storm be outside where it belonged. She finished the interior walls herself on the days when the weather permitted no outdoor work, plastering and whitewashing them until the house smelled clean and looked bright. And she hung a mirror he had brought from town, and a piece of embroidery her mother had made that she had carried all the way from Columbus in the bottom of her trunk for exactly this kind of wall, in exactly this kind of place. He came in one evening and stood in the doorway and looked at what she had done and said nothing for a moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, this looks like a home." "It is a home," she said. "It has been a home, we just hadn't finished it yet." He crossed the room and pulled her close, and she put her arms around him, and they stood together in the middle of the house they were building, in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the life that had assembled itself out of dust and loss, and the specific stubbornness of two people who had decided to stay. By spring the house was complete, every room finished, the front porch added, the proper glass window installed in the room that faced south toward the creek and the grass. Cole had hired on 2 hands to help with the cattle through the summer young men named Pete and Augusto. Pete from Missouri and Augusto from a family who had ranched in this territory for 3 generations before the Americans arrived, and who knew the land and the grass with an intimate knowledge that Cole respected and deferred to in ways that Eleanor found characteristic of him. He learned from whoever had something to teach him, without regard for whether that person was someone the wider culture considered his equal, and she loved him for it. The school year ended in May, and Eleanor spent the summer working on the curriculum for the coming fall, and helping Cole with the books because it turned out she had a head for numbers that was better than his, and writing long letters to her sister Clara in Columbus, describing everything. Clara wrote back with the faithful devotion of someone who had been promised she would be told everything, and her letters were full of humor and longing, and the specific quality of someone who is 18 years old and beginning to understand that she too has choices. In June, Eleanor began to suspect. By July, she was certain. She told Cole on a warm evening when they were sitting on the front porch watching the sun go down over the grass, and she told him the same way she told him everything directly, without preamble. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He turned to look at her, and she watched him absorb it, and the look that came across his face was something she would carry with her always, wonder and terror and profound, bone-deep joy, all 3 at once, making him look temporarily unlike himself, and then more entirely himself than she had ever seen. "Eleanor," he said. He said just her name, and it contained everything. "Sometime around February, I think," she said. He reached out and took her hand and held it tightly. "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm well," she said. "Am somewhat tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, and she felt his breath against her knuckles, and he said against her skin, quietly and with complete sincerity, "Thank you," she laughed softly. "Don't thank me." This was a collaborative effort. "I know," he said. "Am thanking you for all of it, for staying, for not going back to Ohio." He looked up at her with those gray eyes that she had loved since she first saw them, clear and steady and full. "For giving me this life." She turned her hand and pressed her palm against his cheek and looked at him in the evening light. "You gave it to me too," she said. "All of it." The fall school term was the best, yet she had 27 students now, 3 more than the year before, because the town was growing, and the boy from the second row whose name was Henry had become her most dedicated student, which he would have denied vigorously if anyone had said it aloud. She taught through November and into December, until the pregnancy made the full day of standing uncomfortable enough that she arranged for Mrs. Halloran to sit with the class in the afternoons, while Eleanor graded and prepared lessons from home. Thomas Becker published a piece about her in the newspaper, which he wrote with considerable enthusiasm, and which she found slightly embarrassing and generally accurate. The school board, who had initially been uncertain about her, had come around entirely, not because they had changed their fundamental assumptions about women, but because her students were measurably better at reading and arithmetic than they had been under previous arrangements, and pragmatism is its own kind of progress. Clara came from Columbus in January. She arrived on the train, alone, 18 years old, with a trunk of her own and her mother's eyes and Eleanor's stubbornness in a somewhat more openly expressed form. And Eleanor stood on the Caldwell Depot platform, the same platform where she had stood unclaimed 3 hours with her own trunk, and watched her sister step off the train, and looked at her for a moment before they both crossed the space between them, and held each other on the wooden boards with the steam drifting past them. "You look happy," Clara said, pulling back to look at her sister's face with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who knew that face better than any other. "I am," Eleanor said. "Am so happy." "Good," Clara said. "You were owed it." Cole was there with the wagon, and he shook Clara's hand with his characteristic directness, and Clara assessed him with a look Eleanor recognized as the one their mother used to give people, thorough and fair and immediate, and then she nodded once and climbed onto the wagon seat without further ceremony, and Cole helped Eleanor up beside her, and they drove out to the house on the south quarter while Clara asked Cole a series of questions about the ranch that were practical and pointed, and that he answered honestly and in detail. And by the time they arrived at the house, Eleanor could see that he liked her sister very much, and that Clara had concluded, provisionally, that he was adequate, which from Clara was warm approval. Clara stayed. She stayed because the West suited her in the same way it had suited Eleanor, because the space of it and the work of it matched something in her constitution, and because Thomas Becker at the newspaper met her on her 3rd day in town and turned an interesting shade of red, which Clara found entertaining enough to investigate further. She took the room above the general store that Eleanor had vacated and learned typesetting faster than Eleanor had, and within 6 weeks she and Thomas Becker were having arguments about editorial decisions that were clearly courtship in a dialect unique to the two of them, and Eleanor watched this development with profound satisfaction. The baby came in February, as estimated, a boy, born in the house on the south quarter on a clear cold night with Mrs. Halloran and the town doctor both present and Cole in the room, because Eleanor had told him plainly that she wanted him there, and he had not argued, only rolled up his sleeves and done whatever was needed, which was characteristic. He held her hand through the worst of it, and she did not pretend it was painless, but she also did not pretend it was more than she could manage, because it was not. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair, and Eleanor's specific expression of determined dissatisfaction with his immediate circumstances, which Cole pointed out with a kind of delighted wonder. "He looks just like you," Cole said. "He looks like a newborn," Eleanor said. "They all look the same at this stage." "He has your expression," Cole said. "That exact face you make when something is not to your satisfaction." "He has been inside me for 9 months," she said. "He is entitled to have opinions about the transition." Cole was holding the boy with the care of a man who has just been trusted with the most valuable thing in the world, and who is aware of this in every cell of his body, and he looked down at the small dark-haired person in his arms with an expression so open and unguarded that Eleanor felt it like a hand around her heart. "James," Cole said. It was the name they had decided on together for his grandfather. "James Cole Hadley." "Hello, James," Eleanor said, reaching out to touch her son's small fist with one finger. James grabbed it immediately with the focused determination of someone who plans to hold on. "That's my boy," Cole said softly, and he looked up at Eleanor with everything in his face and said, "Thank you for him." For everything. She was tired beyond the capacity of language and more completely happy than she had ever been, and she smiled at him and said, "You are very welcome. Now let me sleep." He laughed quietly and pressed his lips to her forehead, and she closed her eyes. James was a good baby in the sense that he was healthy and strong and curious about everything, and less good in the sense that he had very definite opinions about sleep schedules that did not align with anyone else's. Cole took the night hours without complaint, walking the boy on the front porch in the cold dark, murmuring to him, the two of them alone in the dark with the stars and the coyotes, and Eleanor would wake sometimes and hear them through the open door and lie in the warm bed feeling something she could not name precisely, some deep and quiet fullness. The ranch grew. By the summer of 1884, they had doubled the herd, and Cole had bought an adjacent 40 acres to the east. Pete had stayed on full-time, and Augusto had become something closer to a partner than a hand, his knowledge of the land proving indispensable through drought conditions that hit the summer hard and would have been significantly worse without his guidance on where to find water and which grass would hold and which would not. There were weeks that summer that tested Cole's equanimity and his finances both, and Eleanor managed the books with a tightness that left no room for error and found room anyway. And Thomas Becker published agricultural updates in the paper that Clara had helped research, and the whole town pulled through the dry months together in the particular way that isolated communities do imperfectly, and with considerable argument and ultimately together. Eleanor continued teaching into her second and third school year, and Henry from the second row won a spelling contest at the county level and brought the ribbon back to show her with an expression that said he was not proud about it, and which made it clear that he was entirely proud about it, and she kept the ribbon in her desk drawer for 20 years after that. James learned to walk in the spring of 1884, pulling himself up on everything available, and then launching into the air between objects with the specific fearlessness of someone who has not yet been adequately introduced to consequences. Cole caught him approximately 400 times. Abilene, who had the run of the yard and who had developed a specific, long-suffering relationship with the toddler who was obsessed with her, stood patiently while James grabbed handfuls of mane and attempted to scale her from every possible angle. "He is going to be a horseman," Cole said, watching from the porch. "He is going to break something first," Eleanor said from beside him. "Possibly Abilene's patience, possibly his own arm." "He will be fine," Cole said, with the serene confidence of a man who had broken several things learning the same skills. "I know he will," Eleanor said. "Am allowed to watch with my heart in my throat anyway." He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against him, and they watched their son attempt another assault on the patient mare in the warm afternoon, and the grass moved on the south quarter and the creek ran, and the sky was enormous and clear above everything. Clara married Thomas Becker in the fall of 1884, in the same church, with the same long-winded preacher who had by now developed a genuine affection for these particular Whitmore women, and who delivered a sermon that was considerably warmer than his average. Eleanor stood up with Clara, and Cole stood up with Thomas and Mrs. Halloran cried again in the front row with the same serene thoroughness as before, and James, now nearly 2½ and with decided opinions about formal occasions, sat with Augusto in the back row, and was given periodic pieces of hard candy to maintain the peace. Thomas and Clara had the newspaper and a house 2 blocks from the office, and a genuine, argumentative, passionate partnership that suited both of them perfectly. Clara set type and edited copy, and eventually began writing pieces herself, under her own name, which caused some comment in certain quarters of town, and none whatsoever in the quarters that mattered to her. The letter from Eleanor's father came in the winter of 1884. She opened it at the kitchen table while Cole watched without comment, and she read it and then set it down and looked out the south window at the snow on the grass. "He wants money," she said. "What do you want to do?" Cole asked. Not what should they do, not what was right, simply what did she want. "I want to do nothing," she said. "Is that terrible?" "No," he said. "You do not owe him anything. He is my father. He is a man who treated you as a commodity and is now appealing to the affection he did nothing to earn," Cole said, not unkindly, just plainly. "You can feel both things. You can love him and also not send money you cannot afford." She thought about it for a week, And then she wrote a letter not sending money, but not nothing either, telling her father where she was and who she was and offering, if he was willing to make the same kind of effort she had made, to correspond. She did not know if he would. She sealed the letter and gave it to Thomas for the post and did not lose sleep over it. Her father wrote back once, 6 months later, a short letter that was clearly difficult for him to write, stilted and formal in the way that people are when they are attempting an unfamiliar emotional territory. She wrote back. The correspondence was not warm exactly, but it was honest, and it continued, and it was enough. James turned 3 in February of 1885 and became a person of distinct and uncompromising opinions about everything, which Eleanor found simultaneously exhausting and deeply familiar. He loved horses, he loved being read to, he had no patience for sitting still, and he had Cole's capacity for paying careful attention when something genuinely interested him and Eleanor's capacity for determined pursuit once he had decided he wanted something. By the spring of 1885, Eleanor knew that James was going to be a brother. She told Cole in the same way she had told him the first time on the front porch in the evening, and his reaction was the same in its essential quality, that particular combination of wonder and joy, though more at ease this time, more settled in the abundance of it. "When?" he asked. "October or November, think," she said. He pulled her close and held her, and she felt him press his lips to the top of her head. "Are you glad?" he asked. "Am glad about everything," she said honestly. "Every single thing." The second baby was a girl, born in November 1885, when the first frost had already settled on the grass, and the sky above the south quarter was the kind of clear, cold blue that felt like it went on forever. She was born a little faster than James had been, and with considerably more interest in looking at things immediately. Her eyes open and alert in a way that the doctor said was unusual, and that Cole said was exactly like her mother. They named her Rose, for Eleanor's mother, whose name had been Rosalind. James was fascinated by Rose in the way that 3-year-olds are fascinated by new things fully and indiscriminately, and with complete disregard for the concept of gentle. They had several educational conversations about hands, and about quiet, and about the fact that babies required different handling than the cattle he had begun to follow his father around learning about. And James received these conversations with the same provisional contract-making gravity he had always had, which Eleanor found charming even when it was inconvenient. The years settled into each other in the way that full and active years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the continuous and satisfying accumulation of things built and learned and done. The ranch grew steadily into something solid, not large by the standard of the big outfits, but substantial and well-run, the kind of operation that could survive a bad year because it had been built carefully through the good ones. Cole was known in Caldwell and in the wider territory as a man whose word meant something, and as a man whose land was run with a fairness to the hands and an awareness of the country around him that was not universal in the business. When other ranchers hired without regard for whether the men they were hiring were being squeezed off land that should have remained theirs, Cole made his own hiring decisions on different terms, and Augusto's family worked alongside the ranch for the better part of a decade and were treated as the partners they were. Eleanor taught for 7 years at the Caldwell school, and in that time she watched the children who had sat on the benches in front of her in 1882 grow into young people who could read and reason and argue and ask questions, which she considered the full measure of success. Henry, the boy from the second row who had negotiated about candy on the first day of school, went east to study at the age of 18, with a letter of recommendation from Eleanor that she wrote with genuine pride. He wrote back every Christmas for the rest of her life. She stepped back from full-time teaching in 1889, when she and Cole decided together that the ranch and their family needed her at home in a different way. but she continued to help with the school in an advisory capacity, and with the particular students who needed extra attention, because she could not entirely stop being a teacher any more than she could stop being herself. The morning of their 10th anniversary, in October of 1892, Cole was up before dawn. She heard him moving quietly through the house, and then the sound of the door, and she lay in bed for a moment enjoying the warm and peaceful state of morning before the children woke, and then she got up and put on her robe and went to the window. He was standing on the front porch, looking out at the land. The sun was just beginning to come up over the eastern edge of the grass, turning the whole of it from silver to gold in that slow, profound transformation that still arrested her every time she saw it, even after 10 years of waking to it. She could see his profile from the window, the straight line of his nose, the jaw that was easier to read now that she had memorized it, the broad set of his shoulders against the brightening sky. She went to the door and out onto the porch, and he heard her coming and turned, and he smiled at her the way he had smiled at her since almost the beginning, with everything in it, every warm and careful and certain thing. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Happy anniversary," she said, and she came to stand beside him at the porch rail, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked together at the land in the morning light, the grass of the south quarter rippling in the early wind, the creek catching the sun in pieces and throwing it back, the cattle moving slowly in. The far pasture, the house that had been walls and a roof when they moved into it, now solid and full and complete, with the embroidery of her mother's on the wall inside, and James's drawings on the kitchen windowsill, and Rose's small boots by the door, and the 2 chairs she had bought in anticipation of company worth having still in the front room, worn now from years of use. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. And I love you more than I did on the first day. That is a bold claim, she said. You loved me considerably on the first day. I did, he admitted. But it was nothing compared to this. She turned and looked up at him, this man who had ridden in covered in trail dust to collect a woman he had never met because it was the right thing to do, this man who had loved her carefully and honestly and completely for 10 years, this man who was the whole architecture of her life out here on the Kansas grass. "I think about the platform sometimes," she said, "standing there, 3 hours, not knowing what was going to happen." "I think about it too," he said. "Think about how almost sent Pete," she laughed. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "It seemed like the kind of thing a man should do himself," he said. "Going to collect someone who had come all that way. Felt responsible even though I had nothing to do with any of it." He paused. "And then I saw you sitting on that trunk with your chin up and your carpet bag in your hands, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" she asked. "I thought, there is a woman who is going to be all right," he said. "Whatever happens, she is going to be all right. Just hoped I could be part of what happened." She pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, and he held her. "You are the best part of what happened," she said. "You have always been the best part." They stood together on the front porch of the house they had built on the south quarter of the land along the creek, on the morning of their 10th anniversary, while the Kansas sun continued its steady climb, and the grass moved in the wind and the children were still asleep inside, and the whole of the life they had built together lay around them in every direction, solid and warm and real. It was everything. It had always been going to be everything. She just hadn't known that yet, standing on the depot platform in the summer of 1882, 3 hours unclaimed in the dust and the heat, waiting for a man whose name she had written on a piece of paper and carried in her glove. What came for her instead was better. What came for her was Cole Hadley, covered in trail dust, riding in from the South Road on a big roan horse named Abilene, carrying honest eyes and an honest heart and a willingness to simply show up, which, she had learned in the years since, was the whole of love in its most important form, not the grand gesture, not the perfect plan, but the showing up, day after day. Through drought and winter, and the long ordinary days between the remarkable ones. Through all of it together. James was 11 now, already turning into his father in the careful way he listened and the easy way he sat a horse. And he had also, undeniably, something of his mother in the way he asked questions about everything and refused to accept insufficient answers. Rose was 6 and had decided, with the complete certainty of a 6-year-old who has thought deeply about the matter, that she was going to be a school teacher when she grew up, which made Eleanor quietly and entirely proud every single time she thought about it. Clara and Thomas had 3 children of their own, a boy first, 2 girls after, and the newspaper had grown from a weekly sheet to a proper twice-weekly paper with circulation beyond Caldwell. And Clara's columns were read and argued about across the territory, which she found satisfying in a way that Thomas found both admirable and occasionally challenging, and which suited both of them exactly. Mrs. Halloran had retired from the boarding house in 1890, handing it to a young couple from Nebraska, and she had come to live in a room in Cole and Eleanor's house that she maintained with the same comprehensive efficiency she had applied to the boarding house, and that she inhabited with the authority of a woman who has fully earned the right to do exactly as she pleases. She sat on the front porch in the evenings and told the children stories that were approximately 50% true and entirely captivating, and James and Rose believed every word and knew better, and believed it anyway. Pete had married a woman from Wichita in 1887 and built his own small place adjacent to the eastern 40 acres, and the 2 ranches operated in easy cooperation that had evolved naturally from years of working alongside each other. Augusto's family had established their own firm claim on land south of the creek, navigating the complicated legal terrain of the territory, with a persistence born from generations of knowing that nothing would simply be given, and everything worth having would have to be held and defended, and Cole had been a witness and a supporter in that process in whatever ways he was able to be, because it was the right thing, and because Augusto was a man whose friendship he valued more than most things he had earned in his life. The West was changing, Caldwell was changing. The cattle drives that had defined the town through the 1870 and early 1880s were tapering as the railroad pushed further, and the big open ranges filled with fence lines. The Indian Territory to the south was being broken open by the land rush. Eleanor and Cole had watched the news from the land runs of 1889 and felt the complicated weight of it, knowing what it cost and who paid and what was being taken under the banner of opportunity. And they had talked about it at the kitchen table with the same honesty they brought to everything, because looking away was easier, but it was not something either of them was built for. The world was not perfect, and they had never pretended otherwise. What they had built was not perfect either. It was imperfect and real and continuous, amended by time and experience, and the specific work of 2 people who had chosen each other thoroughly and who went on choosing each other every day. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, after the sun had come fully up and the children had appeared on the porch in various stages of morning disarray, and Mrs. Halloran had come out with coffee for the adults and disapproval for James's hair, and the whole wonderful and ordinary chaos of their life had assembled itself around them. Cole looked at Eleanor across the porch, past their daughter who was sitting on the rail despite being told not to, and their son who was already eyeing the horses, and Mrs. Halloran who was winning an argument with the coffee, and his eyes found hers and held them with the same clear, steady quality they had always had. She looked back at him across all of it and felt the full, specific weight of happiness, not the happiness of absence, of nothing going wrong, but the happiness of presence, of everything that was right being right and known and chosen. She loved him. She had loved him for 10 years with increasing depth and certainty, loved the way he listened, and the way he worked, and the way he held their children, and the way he looked at her in the morning light, as though she were the most interesting and necessary thing in the world to him. She had stood on the depot platform in Caldwell for 3 hours in the summer of 1882, unclaimed and uncertain, with the name of a stranger in her glove. And then a cowboy had ridden in from the south road covered in trail dust, and he had looked at her with careful gray eyes and told her an honest thing, and taken her trunk, and led her to coffee, and come back the next day, and the day after that, and built a life beside her on the Kansas grass, not the life she had planned, but something so much better that planning seemed inadequate as a concept for what it was. It was love. Solid and grown and deeply, completely rooted. It was exactly where she was supposed to be. The children eventually convinced Cole to saddle horses, and James and Rose rode in circles in the yard, while Cole and Eleanor watched from the porch steps, and the sun climbed higher over the south quarter, and the day opened up around them, full and warm and unambiguously theirs. She reached over and took his hand. He held it, the way he always held it, firmly and warmly, and without any indication that he planned to let go. They sat there together in the October morning on the steps of their house on the Kansas grassland, watching their children ride and listening to Mrs. Halloran win an argument with a coffee pot, and the creek ran at the bottom of the south quarter, and the sky went on forever above the golden grass, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that needed to be built was built, and everything that needed to be loved was loved, and the whole of it was enough. The whole of it was everything.